Welcome to Forgotten Stories from Guyana and the Caribbean. Here is where we explore the history and memories that have made us Guyanese and West Indians. Forgotten Stories with Aaron Darcy. In today's episode, we will discuss the 1983 invasion of Grenada. Today we will talk about Grenada, that beautiful spice island in the Caribbean. Let's look back at two military invasions by different forces at different times in its history. Hi there, welcome once again to Forgotten Stories from Guyana and the Caribbean with Aaron Darcy. I am Ryan, your host for today. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time as we explore some of the events that have shaped the history of Guyana and the Caribbean. The first military invasion of Grenada occurred during the time of the American Revolutionary War. This was also the time when Britain and France were at war with each other. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 2, 1779, French forces secretly landed on the British-held West Indian island of Grenada and on the night of July 3, launched an assault on the British fortifications. The sounds of cannons and crack of artillery exploded in the silence of the night as the French attacked the British forces on Hospital Hill, which overlooked the island's capital, St. George's. In a masterful move, they captured the British cannons and turned them against the British forces in Fort George. Facing the formidable challenge of defending St. George's, British Governor Lord Macartney swiftly initiated negotiations for surrender. But the French commander rejected the governor's terms and insisted on harsher conditions. Lord Macartney ultimately chose to surrender unconditionally. The French troops occupied Grenada until July 5 of that year, but hastily left the island when they learned that a British fleet under Admiral John Byron was approaching. Before the French could safely escape, a fierce battle ensued between the two sides, resulting in severe damage to several British and French vessels. Both sides eventually retreated to their bases. Control of the island of Grenada was disputed by Great Britain and France in the 18th century, with the British ultimately prevailing. Under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, France later returned Grenada to full British control at the end of the First World War in 1918. The second invasion of Grenada began at dawn on the 25th of October, 1983. The United States and a coalition of 6 Caribbean nations invaded the island nation, which is located 100 miles north of Venezuela. This second invasion would have a more impactful effect on the political and social fabric of our Caribbean nation in the 20th century. Let us now look at the events that led up to, not only the invasion of a Caribbean island, but to the deliberate murder, execution style of Maurice Bishop, one of the region's most vibrant leaders. The late 1960s and 1970s was a time of revolutionary awakening across the world and no less in the Caribbean region. During this transformative era, highly educated Guyanese and West Indian students were returning to their countries with a fresh mindset, one that demanded a departure from the old colonial norms. The Vietnam War was being fought in Asia and in the Caribbean. Cuba, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, had recently declared its liberation from dictatorship. Wars of rebellion were bringing changes throughout Central and South America. But in Grenada, Eric Gairy, who was trained in British colonial administration, continued to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors as Premier and afterwards as Prime Minister of independent Grenada. However, the confluence of global and regional forces was creating an environment ripe for change, shaping the course of history not only in the Caribbean but also across the world. These changes would seriously affect life in our region. The people in Guyana and in the Caribbean nations had become disenchanted with decades of colonial rule and felt a burning desire to be freed from that inherited oppression. New leaders were emerging from the ranks of ordinary people, and they were clamoring for socio-economic reform and transparent governance. Younger and more educated people were ready to lead the way. And just about that time, there was a growing fear of communism sweeping across the USA and in Britain as well, especially after what had just happened in Cuba. This in turn created fierce opposition to this sort of nonsense ever happening in another Caribbean country. But there was indeed a revolution beginning to evolve in the Spice Island of Grenada. In 1970, huge demonstrations erupted in both Trinidad and Grenada, and in Grenada, protesters took action to highlight the oppressive and corrupt regime of the Gary administration. Maurice Bishop, a lawyer, was gradually becoming recognized as a leader in the Caribbean. His involvement had started when he returned to Grenada in December 1970. He supported striking nurses at St. George's General Hospital in the capital, and although he and a few of them were arrested, they were eventually acquitted after a 7-month trial. Maurice Bishop had become one of the more radical leaders to emerge onto the political scene in Grenada and across the Caribbean region. This now put him in a position of personal danger from the political elite in his country. In November of 1973, the government security forces arrested Bishop and several other persons. They were beaten and thrown in jail. Again, in February 1974, on the day before Grenada gained independence from Great Britain, Bishop was arrested and charged with plotting to assassinate the Prime Minister, Eric Gary. He was subsequently released and went to the USA for a while. The Spice Island of Grenada had now become an independent nation with Eric Gary as Prime Minister. In March of that same year, Bishop participated in a meeting of the Pan-African Congress that was held in Guyana, and in 1976, returned home and was elected to represent St. George's Southeast in Grenada's parliament. Not long after, he became leader of the opposition in Grenada's House of Representatives and part of the official opposition to Eric Gary's Grenada Labour Party. In 1977, Bishop as opposition leader visited the communist country of Cuba and met that country's leader Fidel Castro. This further cemented his position as an unwanted influence in Caribbean politics of the time. Following elections in 1978, Bishop helped to form a coalition of opposition forces to challenge the existing status quo. During a meeting in Martinique, another island nation, strategies for moving forward were discussed at length. By then, the Movement for Assemblies of People, a new political group led by Bishop, had already been active for over 5 years. This group now merged with the Dual political group, resulting in the creation of the new Dual movement, DEN-JM. Maurice Bishop and Unison Whiteman were elected leaders. The main opposition in Grenada at that time was the Grenada National Party headed by former Prime Minister Herbert Blaise. Blaise had been one of the region's revolutionary leaders who were heavily influenced by the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement was considered to have adopted a Marxist-Leninist ideology and was part of the worldwide communist movement of the time. The Grenada Revolution exploded onto the Caribbean political scene on March 13, 1979, and sent shockwaves across the region and around the world. On that day, the new Dual movement overthrew the Eric Gary government in a bloodless coup, suspended the country's constitution, and declared Maurice Bishop as its new prime minister. The news of this sudden and dramatic change in Grenada quickly spread throughout the Caribbean and beyond. The leaders of these countries, as well as the government in the USA, took careful note and continued to keep a close and cautious eye on the country and its new administration. The years went by, and Grenada maintained relations with many other countries. The new government quickly strengthened relations with Cuba and began a series of projects, among which was the construction of a new international airport at the southern end of the island. The airport was designed by European architects and engineers but was being financed by the government of Cuba. Cuba was also providing the engineers and labor force for the actual construction of the project. This, of course, raised the hackles of some officials within the American administration. The U.S. government of President Ronald Reagan had been closely monitoring the developments in Grenada and began to make objections to the construction of this new airport. As early as March 1983, Reagan had accused Grenada of intending to use the new airport's long airstrip for Soviet military aircraft. He suggested that the size of the airstrip and the other facilities being constructed there were more suited to military rather than civilian use. And of course, memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis were a stark reminder of the dangers of such a possibility. By this time, 1983, the people of Grenada seemed to have adjusted to the change in government, but after 4 years, discontent with the revolution and with the new government quickly began to emerge. Even among the leadership of the new Dual movement, the party now in power under Bishop, disagreement was slowly showing up. A People's Revolutionary Army had been established, but after a while, was regarded as a private military force for the party in power. A similar situation existed in neighboring Guyana. Later that same year, 1983, certain leaders in the new dual movement government asked Bishop to step down or agree to a power-sharing arrangement with his deputy prime minister, Bernard Cord. Bishop refused to do this and was promptly deposed and placed under house arrest. There was an instant and angry reaction from the people, especially supporters of Maurice Bishop. Large demonstrations followed Bishop's arrest, and his supporters forcefully freed him and demanded that he be returned to the position of prime minister. Tensions grew as the hours flew by. Businesses closed their doors and ordinary people stayed at home. Bishop and the demonstrators eventually made their way to the army base at Fort Rupert, from where they planned to retake control of the government and the country. But by then, there were other, more powerful forces lined up against Bishop. Soldiers from another army base were swiftly dispatched to Fort Frederick, and following a brief battle, Bishop and 7 others, including his former cabinet ministers, were arrested. Those that wanted to be rid of Bishop did so expeditiously. A trial and severe justice followed. A 4-man army firing squad was formed, and Bishop and the others were executed by gunfire and their bodies destroyed by burning. In no time at all, the leadership of Maurice Bishop had been totally erased, and those that had opposed and executed Bishop established a revolutionary military government with Hudson Austin as its head. All of this had taken place during the first week of October 1983. It was after this series of events that the second military invasion of Grenada would be launched. The leaders of the other Caribbean countries had been closely following the situation in Grenada ever since the coup that had overthrown the Eric Gairy government. When news of the murders of Bishop and the others reached them, they, along with the Governor-General of Grenada, appealed to the Reagan administration for assistance in restoring order in Grenada. Their request was answered, and on the 25th of October, 1983, the invasion of Grenada, code-named Operation Urgent Fury, was launched. U.S. military forces, along with troops from Jamaica and some countries within the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, landed in Grenada and swiftly overcame resistance from the Grenadian military forces. The situation in Grenada was brought under control within just a few days, bringing peace and relief to the citizens of that country. Supporters and cabinet ministers of the new dual movement, the party that had been in power when Bishop was executed, seemed to expect that they would be allowed to continue running the country, but that did not happen. The U.S. administration expressed its concern that the NJM's growing connections with Cuba and other communist states posed a serious threat to democracy in the Caribbean region, which of course could not be allowed to continue. Between the American and Caribbean authorities, a decision was reached, and an interim government headed by Governor-General Paul Scoon was put in place. The American and Caribbean governments quickly reaffirmed Scoon as Queen Elizabeth's sole legitimate representative in Grenada, and hence the only lawful authority on the island. Grenada was a member of the British Commonwealth of Nations, and the Queen was still head of state. So in accordance with Commonwealth constitutional practice, Scoon assumed power as interim head of government. An advisory council was formed, and named Nicholas Brathwaite as chairman, pending new elections. In August of the following year, 1984, there was a merger of political parties in Grenada, resulting in the formation of the new National Party. In December 1984, elections were once again held in Grenada, and the new National Party won 14 out of 15 seats. Herbert Blaise, the leader of the new National Party, was made Prime Minister of Grenada. For many years after this period of revolutionary upheaval, there were still some Grenadians that felt strong disagreement about the military invasion of their country by outside forces. Had Grenadians been rescued from the violence of a civil war? Or did they have their political future decided for them? Political and academic debates would continue for a very long time about the invasion of Grenada, and this series of incidents have remained an indelible part of the history of the Caribbean. What are your thoughts on the second military invasion of Grenada? Leave a comment below, and if you found this podcast interesting, please like and share it and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for joining us as we look back at forgotten stories from Guyana and the Caribbean. Join us for the next episode. Goodbye for now.